we're going to be looking at art from World War II to the present, and some of the main art movements we're going to be coming across are abstract expressionism, pop art, and then an umbrella term for a great many movements, postmodernism. We saw at the end of last week how artists were exploring surrealist themes and ideas dealing with automatic painting or automatic writing, trance states, the idea of ritual, and this whole concept of making images that seem to have come about quite spontaneously and quite randomly. Well, these artists that moved to the United States from Europe during World War II brought a lot of these ideas over to America, and they took root. They had a large and lasting impact on American artists, and as a result gave birth to one of the first, if not the first, major international art movement that comes from the United States, known as abstract expressionism. As the name implies, the work was largely non-representational, using the word abstract again in the wrong way, but we all understand what that means now, and being expressive, communicating the artist's inner self. Probably the artist most associated with this movement is an artist by the name of Jackson Pollock. Here he is, here is one of his paintings, Lavender Mist. What he attempted to do was, again, push the boundaries of painting. How far could painting go? And so one of those boundaries was the idea of having a composition or having something in the painting that was a focal point that you would look at that would be more important than another part of the painting. And as we saw the trend in European painting and Cubism as such, artists began to take awareness of the entire painted surface and sort of treat the entire surface almost equally. And this kind of hits its final phase in the work of Pollock. The other thing about Pollock was he came from the Midwest, and as a boy in the Midwest growing up, he got to observe various Navajo Indian rituals where they did sand paintings, where the Indians would create a work of art using colored sand in a ritualistic format, and then at the end of that destroy the work, blow the sand away. And so that had a great impact on Pollock and the idea of art being a record of an activity, and that in and of itself, was also quite ephemeral. He also was very much interested in psychology and was taking therapy, Jungian therapy, for a number of years. And so he was interested in mining the depths of the unconscious mind. And so the whole combination of psychology and Indian sand paintings and the history of art led Pollock to make paintings such as this. Here he is in 1949 doing his paintings. As a result of his dripping technique, he was labeled as Jack the Dripper. As a bit of a tongue-in-cheek pun. Another artist famous for in this period of abstract expressionism was Willem de Kooning. These are artists that were living at the time in New York, although de Kooning was not American. He came over from Europe. Different than Pollock, here we have some sort of representation of a woman, at least according to de Kooning. But it's again the brushstroke and the mark and the energy and the sort of vitality of the artist in a sort of trance state or in a very sort of excited state, making these marks on the canvas. And these marks became synonymous with subjectivity. This was a record of the artist's hand, the artist's thinking, the artist's feeling. And if that artist was famous, then anything that bore his or her mark, and it was mostly his mark, became very, very well known and genuinely sought after. So painting began to be transformed in America into this large, bold, expressive kind of freedom of brushwork. The irony is a lot of these works were also funded secretly by the CIA to be toured throughout Europe as part of the Cold War, saying, we're so crazy over here, we're so free over here, we let our artists get away with this kind of stuff. Knowing full well that the Russians at that point were embracing social realism as the sort of epitome of great art. And so the sense of freedom and spontaneousness found in American Expressionism was seen as a cultural jab at the Russians and their more traditional state-sponsored type of art. Abstract Expressionism had a wide variety of developments. Everybody wasn't just dripping paint and splattering their brush on the canvas. But Mark Rothko was one of those artists who was working in the abstract expression idea of making non-representational works, usually very large, and with the brushstrokes directly on the canvas. But Rothko was interested more in the spiritual aspect of painting and the power of painting to transport somebody into a state of contemplation or a state of trance or a state of prayer. And so he created these large monolithic paintings, usually of several, not muted, but limited range of colors, so yellows and reds, or pinks and oranges, or blues and greens. And the idea for Rothko was to totally disengage color from objects. We saw earlier that with the Fauve painters and Matisse and Derain, they were freeing color from the object by making the objects have arbitrary color, so blue bananas, yellow skies, pink sand. But here, Rothko goes one further. In the same way that Pollock was going one further in composition, Rothko is going one further by dislocating color from any sort of object whatsoever and just presenting the viewer with pure color. And the idea was that if you stood or sat in front of these paintings for a very long time and stared at the color, that the painting will begin to work upon your consciousness and therefore create the desired effect that Rothko was after, which was basically a sort of spiritual, non-body experience of lifting you out of this world by immersing you in pure color. This was taken to its logical conclusion in the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas, where people could come and actually sit down on these benches, stare at his works. This period of work was rather dark and somber, but the picture doesn't really do it justice. There's a lot of purples, deep purples and blues and magentas and crimsons. And here the whole building was designed as a chapel, as a place of worship, and what was on the walls was quite clearly just these large paintings by Rothko that people would contemplate and sit in front of and just enter into being quiet and peaceful and moving into a sort of an engagement with the work. So we're beginning to see in an interesting sort of way a return to many of the previous roles of art and painting, the ritualistic and here the sort of the spiritual. In reaction to abstract expressionism was a movement called pop art. Now, pop art was an interesting response. It was everything abstract expressionism wasn't. And so to sum it up, we could look at a picture like this. Now, how do we distinguish this picture from the previous work we've seen, most notably, for instance, the work of Jackson Pollock? Well, quite clearly it's pictures of something. They're not abstract marks. The other thing is, what are they pictures of? Well, for the pop artists, they were pictures of popular culture. So in here we have, the car, the girl, and the SpaghettiOs. Pop art was a reaction against the sort of elitist, highly educated, ivory tower academic idea of abstract expressionism. People had a hard time understanding abstract expressionism. Even though Jackson Pollock found himself on the cover of Time magazine, you still had to take a class or read a book to understand what you're supposed to be looking at. So people were deferring to the experts to sort of fill them in on what this was about, because this seemed to have no relationship to the common man on the street, to anything to do with art. And so abstract expressionism had connected to it a large body of writings and commentaries and books attempting to explain it. And part of the pop art reaction was they were a little tired of that you shouldn't have to take a class on art history to understand what you were looking at. So they wanted something that was more immediate, more impactful, and much more down to earth and not so high and mighty. And so they chose very common, very mundane subject matters. Probably the epitome of that is Andy Warhol and his Campbell's soup can. This was the complete opposite of abstract expressionism in two main ways: subject matter, what was in the painting, and technique. So from a subject matter point of view, it's everything I just described, whereas abstract expressionism might belong to that tradition of great European painting where you refer to an expert to interpret the painting for you, to explain the people in the painting or to explain the abstraction. Pop artists were interested in something very immediate and very mundane, and that immediacy had to be really, really almost a laughable, low on the totem pole subject for art. And so whereas the history of painting dealt with saints and sinners and kings and queens, or Pollock's abstraction, the opposite, the complete opposite of all of that would have been Campbell's soup, Brillo, something you find in the local store. It was considered low art, and low art was below the esteem of many artists, so the pop artists embraced it. The other difference was technique. Whereas Jackson Pollock was in the tradition of oil paint on canvas, creating unique works that marked his particular touch, much pop art was mass-produced, silk-screened, multiple copies were made, and so they were changing the response to art on two fundamental levels. The subject matter changed and the technique changed, and we have seen that all throughout the history of this course. When the Impressionists came along, what did they do? They changed the subject matter and they changed the technique. They changed the definition of the artist. And here, the third element, pop art really changed the definition of the artist. The artist wasn't coming up with unique and original ideas that were really hard to grasp, that were really ahead of their time. The artist was merely just someone picking something out of society, having it mass-produced, and signing their name to it. So it was a very cheap slap in the face in many ways to the art establishment, and what we found happening was that the general society of the United States and England really embraced this art because it was accessible, it was fun, it didn't take itself too seriously, and it very quickly and easily went from the gallery walls onto fashion, onto design, in many, many senses. They also poked fun at the idea of the brushstroke. Here's Roy Lichtenstein doing his version of the brushstroke, which had become charged with so much meaning of the subjectivity of the tortured individual expressive artist. And so he creates his own brushstroke using the idiom of comic books. Obviously, this is a very meticulous image. It has no spontaneity connected to it at all. Plus, it's flat and it's very graphic. So, kind of a tongue-in-cheek jab towards the abstract expressionists here. Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe. Again, this just encapsulates everything I just described. It's a silkscreen, which is a printing technique often used on t-shirt printing. There are multiples, so there's no one Marilyn, there's 9, and Warhol would make as many as people wanted. So the idea of a unique, special relic or treasure that you would make a special trip to go and see it, like the Mona Lisa, was kind of thrown out the window. Here's Andy Warhol saying, here's a bunch of Marilyns or a bunch of Elvises. And he was doing that for two reasons. One, to sort of undermine the whole idea of the sacred object in art, but two, to make a comment on society that Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, these celebrities that people were living with, watching on the television and the silver screen, were really mass-produced people that were taken over by bigger forces than them. Their lives were dominated by ways to be, ways to look, ways to act. And so for Andy Warhol, these people were manufactured, they were mass-produced, and so his approach of mass production led into that and sort of fed into that whole idea. Bridget Riley, a British artist, began to sort of look at this abstraction and turn it a little more geometric, take out the expressive part of it, take out the individual, and create something that is still abstract, but at the same time very much less personal, more pattern-oriented, more decorative. And these works, like I said, this is the kind of stuff that went from the gallery wall onto a mini skirt in a matter of seconds. The whole Austin Powers movie series is a celebration of this pop art, this kind of fast, quick, sexy, fun, rock and roll kind of art where you didn't really need to go to school. You got it. It was cool. It pissed off the old people. They couldn't understand how this could be considered art. We've heard this many, many times in this course. This is just the latest incarnation. Well, not the latest, but in the 1960s it was. And so pop art was a very powerful, strong element that went all through European and American culture. Here's a sculptural expression of that. We think of sculpture as being about special people doing special things, usually bronze horses with General Washington on it, very sort of meaningful and serious kinds of work. Here's Claes Oldenburg taking a giant clothespin, making it into sculpture. So there was a lot of humor to pop art, a lot of fun, a lot of not taking yourself seriously, but at the same time enjoying these things. They weren't making fun of popular culture, they weren't being ironic, they were just celebrating popular culture as it had come to be defined after the war. Now, when we come to the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, we pretty much are unable to track it by dominant movements. We have too many things happening. And so what I'm going to show you is just a series of approaches and ideas that came to the surface from the 1960s till today. One of them was hard edge abstraction. We kind of saw this with Bridget Riley's black and white checkerboard, but artists were looking at abstract elements but taking out, like I said, that expressive individual brush mark and just recording a very sort of strong sense of design, of pattern, of impact. So this kind of really does embody Rothko's big colors and Pollock's non-representational work, but at the same time giving it a very sort of pop art, kind of clean line, bright color, fun, but at the same time confusing or mysterious or unusual type of art. Another type of art we found expression at this time was conceptualism. Conceptual art was the idea that art can be an idea. This is different than Duchamp's. Duchamp was talking about the idea of art. This is talking about art, about an idea being art. So the idea of a chair. What is a chair? In this case, is it a physical object? Is it a photograph? Or is it a definition? Now, some of these artists would just produce descriptions and definitions and pin them to the wall, and the act of reading it would create an image in your mind or an idea in your mind, and that would be the art itself. And so artists were just kind of exploring all these little roads. Many of them became dead ends, but at the time they were sort of interesting and exciting to explore, but they didn't really have a lot of lasting power. They were sort of one-hit wonders, and I'd certainly put Kossuth in that category. A huge element that came out of art at this time was feminism. With women's rights and civil rights in the 60s and the late 60s, feminist art historians and feminist artists began to take another look at the art world, and this time through a very particularly female point of view. This piece by Judy Chicago is one of the most famous feminist works. It's called The Dinner Party, and it quite simply is a table setting, a rather large table, and at each setting was a famous woman through history, and the tiles on the floor were the names of 999 other famous women through history. So for some people, this became a little bit of a scholarly piece of work, because people were looking at the names and saying, well, I've never heard of this person. They would go look them up, and all of a sudden we had many young women and men getting PhDs in feminism by studying these lost women of history that nobody really wrote about or did much about, or who might have been famous in their time but have sort of disappeared over time from the general consciousness. So there was this element in feminist work of teaching, of trying to rewrite history or add to the historical record about the contributions of women. What's interesting about this piece is that it's a domestic piece. It's a table setting with plates and goblets and knives and forks. And for many artists or people in the art world, this kind of domestic kind of work, ceramics and tapestry, was very much seen as a woman's work, or craft work, which again is sort of lower down the totem pole. It's considered, craft. It's functional, whereas real art should be non-functional and one of a kind. And so she was making a real statement about the kind of art women had been participating in largely throughout history as being very participatory and very collaborative, whereas men's art tends to be much more isolationist and very competitive. This is my work, my piece, and my sculpture, and my architecture. Whereas this was made with many, many people. Judy Chicago was just the sort of conductor, so to speak. So it's very collaborative in the sense that what she was trying to do was define the idea of the artist again differently from Andy Warhol, but by saying an artist doesn't have to be alone, isolated in his studio, struggling to be totally original. That women throughout history have always been much more cooperative, collaborative, and don't have the sort of ego attached to their work that many male artists have. The other thing about this kind of work was it initiated a whole slew of works that dealt specifically with an imagery that was very woman-centered. So you get a close-up here, you look at the plates, you notice how much the plates look like vaginas, and this was intentional. This was a specific type of female imagery that had never existed historically. It was related to many, many plant forms or seed forms or shell forms, and so Judy Chicago and many of the early feminists believed in something known as essentialism, which is that there is a woman's essence. There is something that fundamentally differentiates a woman from a man, and this essence should be made into art. The woman's art should be different than a man's art, and the woman should stick to these sort of very women-like themes and ideas in their art. So we had a whole slew of works of paintings that referenced plants and female genitalia and whatnot. One of the interesting things about feminist criticism in art was the way they analyzed pictures. That the analysis of feminist historians and critics really unveiled the power that a picture has in creating its society. For many people, art reflects society. They think of the artwork as being a reflection of the times. One of the things that feminist historians tried to really make central to their argument was that art not only reflects, but it also creates. And so if you have an artwork which portrays a woman in a particular way, that idea of womanhood is going to be replicated in the society as young girls grow up to be women. And so they looked back at the history of art and they found that there is a particular way in which women seem always to have been portrayed, and that is as objects, an object of beauty, something you look at. And so here's an example going back to the Renaissance of Titian's Venus of Urbino. She's on display, she's looking at you, she's coy, she's passive, and what makes her special is her physical attractiveness. And the historians notice that the men don't have the same criteria. A man can be very ugly and fat and warts all over his face and disgusting, but as long as he was powerful or rich or educated, the images, he was also he was seen as attractive. And so men would have a great range of possibilities of how to be, whereas a woman's range was largely limited to her physical appearance. And they tracked this all through the history of art. Stereotypes was another thing, not just physical stereotypes, but the characters of women and men. Here men are seen as strong and upstanding, we've seen this earlier, and the women are too weak, weepy, too emotional, unable to cope with these things. And so these historians were looking at the power of art to create its society, and that the images we make of people are images that are not necessarily reflections or true reflections. They're manufactured reflections, and that they're made by certain people at certain time. And so images like this, for example, are clearly made by men to sort of bolster and portray what they consider the stereotypes of what a woman is and what a man is. And part of the feminist movement was to try and deconstruct that, to say that there is no way, there is no type. A woman can do as much as a man can, and a man can be more feminine if he chooses to. And so they were trying to undo, at a cultural level, a lot of these sort of built-in stereotypes that many people just took for granted as being natural. So many artists began to look at the female body and the role of the woman in art. Here's Jenny Saville. These are huge paintings depicting a woman's body in a very confrontational, very large, very untypical sort of way, with her body marked and gouged on, and the marks become synonymous with, what we project onto women's bodies, how we, in a sense, inscribe on them ideas of the female body, and also the role of plastic surgery and women altering their bodies and wanting to have the perfect body, and liposuction and all of this stuff and the drawing that goes on. These are the things, especially the drawing, was very important to Jenny Savile. Other artists like Alice Neel began to look at the body in another way and say, well, here's a self-portrait of me as an old lady. And so what the feminists had done is they'd taken the lid off of how things were represented. And it wasn't just about women being represented in a certain way. It was about almost everybody being represented in a certain way. And so old people, octogenarians, grandmas, grandpas, we never see them in art, and we do, we certainly never see them naked. So many of these artists were exploring these other ways of looking, and then the power of looking in the gaze and how it relates to art. So this is an idea that we're going to see in these next few slides. Takes a great many developments. One of those is postmodernism. The postmodernism is a general blanket term for a great many things. It's very hard to define, or rather it's very hard to have an agreed definition, so I'm not even going to attempt that. I'm just going to give you a little bit of the origins of it and some of the expressions of postmodernism. The term actually came from the realm of architecture. Through most of the 20th century, the international style that we saw last week was dominant, and so the skyscraper, the idea of form follows function, the way it looks should be based on what it's designed to do, and so anything that was arbitrary or unnecessary would be left out. So things became sleek, they became modern, and it became synonymous with modern power. Within the world of architecture, artists like Charles Moore began to make things like this. Now these were mishmashes of historical styles. So we have the Roman arches and the Greek columns. We've got color painted on them. We've got decoration. And not surprisingly, the inspiration for this kind of architecture came from Las Vegas and Disneyland. But when people like Moore were doing this, and this is his Piazza d'Italia, and here's the same one at night lit with colored lights, many of the old school architects, the international style, just couldn't believe it. This was crass, this was stupid, this was childish, this was Vegas, this wasn't real serious architecture. But the playfulness of Moore and his colleagues caught on, and architecture began to had this sort of freedom of no longer being confined to the traditional narrative of what is architecture. And in the same way, it opened the door for painting, for sculpture, for design, to follow similar paths, to sort of pick and choose from the history of art, almost like a buffet or a banquet. Lots of different styles to put together in lots of different ways, and to have fun with it, essentially. Frank Gehry, another architect currently alive. You look at this building, he also designed many buildings in Los Angeles. Something that never could have happened if the international style was still dominant, and also couldn't have happened without the computer. These plans and drawing buildings like this were impossible with the advent of computer-aided design. Architects and artists were able to design buildings that were just phenomenally bizarre and completely new to the visual landscape of our towns and cities. So some of the characteristics of postmodernism would include a mix of styles, so they weren't purists, they weren't trying to stay with one school of thought. They often dealt with marginalized art forms, art by women, for example, art by people of color, for example, and they often dealt, as a result of dealing with these other things, with social issues and commentary. So you can't really deal with the art of Hispanic Americans without also getting somehow involved in the social issues, the commentaries, or the politics of Spanish Americans. Keith Haring was a famous graffiti artist. He sort of put graffiti into the central art world, and so people began to look at street art, which was largely a marginalized art, but became center stage in the 70s and 80s as people began to look at this as a form of expression, of urban expression, and part of the uneducated aura of not being not being a trained artist working in the art world, but working outside the boundaries of the art world. Many artists became suspicious of the art world for its ability to commodify and capitalize on selling art and making millions and millions off of paintings. And so they wanted to explore other avenues where you couldn't buy the art, you couldn't sell it, you couldn't make money off it, but still it was a genuine human expression. And one of the other things Haring was dealing with was AIDS. He died of AIDS himself. So the social issues surrounding AIDS and sexuality and street art were all sort of tied up in Herring's work. Basquiat, another young street artist dealing with you know, text and images and kind of crude drawing and being untrained and African American culture in the city and its violence and its drugs, also was another very well known graffiti artist. Probably the most famous today is a guy named by the name of Banksy, who is supposedly anonymous. People don't know who he is. He sort of comes in the middle of the night, does some work somewhere, and disappears. So his works are, you know, some people know who he is, but he's not someone taking credit for it in a public way. And his style of graffiti and art is really sort of like an art terrorist. He sort of creates subversive messages in a society. So here he is with appropriating images of children soldiers in various wars, but changing the bullets for crayons. So there's a sense of humor, social commentary, and also sort of subversive terrorist about his work. Another one by Banksy. And this is one in Palestine. This is the wall separating Palestine from Egypt, and he's got the big cut here symbol. Another one in London, British police or British officer. He made his name really before his graffiti work with works like this. And these were paintings that he snuck into famous museums and hung on the walls, and nobody noticed. Usually it took about 2 or 3 days for people to notice that the painting wasn't there before and shouldn't be there. So he took a great pleasure in sort of sneaking his paintings into very, very famous museums like the Tate or the National Gallery or the Smithsonian. And he would take pictures of his work and people looking at his work while they're in. So I highly recommend you look up Banksy online. This is spelled wrong, sorry, it's Banksy. And this particular piece was snuck into the General's Gallery in the Portrait Gallery in London. There's a room full of generals and you know, men of war, and here we have obviously a message, a very contemporary message dealing with that issue. Other artists embraced advertising as a form of expression and the mentality of modern society, and so Barbara Kruger's "I shop, therefore I am" is a pun on a very famous philosophical saying, "I think, therefore I am." And this sort of summed up a lot of meaning for people, that their sense of self, their sense of meaning was tied to their objects and their toys and their possessions. And so social commentary became a great, powerful sort of vehicle for many, many artists. We even see that today. We see Chinese artists embodying capitalist notions and sort of mixing them all together, sort of mishmash of communism and capitalism, and this sort of silly kind of confusion that the whole thing makes. And I think it's a very appropriate comment for the situation today. Artists are still dealing with pop art themes, baloney and Mr. Potato Head and all these things. Jeff Koons is a very well-known artist. At the moment, these are huge paintings about 12 feet tall and 24 feet wide, painted by a team of assistants. So he's really sort of taking the Andy Warhol idea and just sort of giving it his own twist. A lot of works in the postmodern category were very controversial. We've seen Chris O'Feely's The Black Virgin Mary before. Here he's using this piece right here, which is a piece of elephant dung stuck to the painting. So it wasn't just that the Virgin Mary was a black woman and he was commenting on race, but he was using materials that his own culture, Nigerian culture, would use in art as a sacred material. But in here, in the context of a museum and a Christian theme, it was seen as a sacrilegious sort of painting. So this idea of controversy and religion and being sacrilegious was really big throughout the 80s. Here's Andreas Serrano's Piss Christ. He took a plastic crucifix and suspended it in a tub of his own urine and took a photograph, claiming that he was a very proclaimed Catholic who went to church regularly, and claiming that the color of urine just gives a certain glow and a color you'd never capture in any other way. So he was trying to really capture and make a very beautiful image of Christ. But I don't think anybody's falling for that. I think they all realize he was out to sort of by calling it Piss Christ also, out to sort of make a statement and get his name pretty well known. This is an interesting piece. This is a piece called My Sweet Lord, and it's a sculpture of Jesus made of chocolate. This is one of the things we're going to see in postmodern art. Materials become, just all sorts of varied materials. Artists are no longer stuck to traditional materials. We just saw that with Serrano's urine and the elephant dung in Chris Ofili's painting. But this is an interesting painting because the controversy that it created. It was shown in a gallery in New York, a gallery that was owned by a hotel, and it was exhibited during Easter. And there was lots of protest outside the gallery to close the gallery down because of the nature of the work. It was seen as sacrilegious, as poking fun at Christianity. Many of the protesters were decrying the use of American artists to criticize their own country, and why wouldn't they, for example, ever make a piece of Muhammad made out of pork? Why are they always attacking American values? But in this piece, they had unfortunately missed the point. What Cavallaro was trying to say was that we have taken our holidays in the United States, our sacred days, and we have turned them into consumer fiestas where they're just full of big sales events and they're about shopping. And Easter in particular was all about chocolate. And he was trying to say that we've taken Easter and turned it into bunnies and chocolate, and we've lost the real meaning. And so he's trying to make the point that society has made Jesus into chocolate, and by him doing it, he's just commenting on that. But unfortunately, that point wasn't made, or wasn't taken by the people protesting, and the gallery had to shut down as a result. Continuing the theme of unusual materials, this is Mark Quinn. This is a portrait of his head cast with his own blood. So he drew his own blood, poured it into a mold, and now it's casted. And to keep the blood solid, it's in a frozen container. Hence, you see the sort of the ice and the crystals on the side of it. Another artist who is dealing a lot with imagery is Joel Peter Witkin. His work is very disturbing. He shows things that are very challenging visually. This is an actual person with no arms and no legs and no hair. He was born in the 60s. His mother was part of an experiment where women were given thalidomide to help counter morning sickness, but it really was doctors experimenting with drugs on women, and so he was born with no arms, no legs, and no eyelids. So all his life he's got an assistant who's constantly pouring water into his eyes, little eye drops, saline drops. And so Witkin, the artist, decided to make him a martyr, because he was martyred on the altar of science in the 1960s America as an experiment to see what would happen. And so he's dressed him up using all the accoutrements of Western art history in terms of how saints and martyrs were portrayed. So the arrow, for example, would be Saint Sebastian, and the meat cleaver in the head, Saint Bernard. And so he was making the comment of this young man, this person, being a martyr of our society. Likewise with this person, Abundance. This is a real person. She has no body from the hips down. Many people criticize Witkin for taking advantage and exploiting these people for his own artwork. In this particular case, she, the woman involved, actually applauds Witkin. She said in a video once, "When I'm pushed down the street by my caretaker in a wheelchair, people avert their eyes when they look at me. The minute they recognize what they're looking at, they turn their head. They don't know what to say." And she said, "Can you imagine going through life where everybody turns their eyes away from you?" And she says, even fully healthy physical people crave attention, want to be looked at, want to be seen, either in the eyes of a loved one or their peers or their society. And she said, if you have that kind of feeling and you have your full body intact, can you imagine what it's like for myself? And so she says, working with Joel Peter Witkin, being part of his photography, is for her an opportunity to be seen, to be looked at, to be heard, to be recognized. And so she sees Witkin's involvement with her and various other people as a very positive role. But Witkin is pushing the envelope. He's trying to find something really so bizarre and disturbing to sort of question the idea of what is freakish, what is normal, and what is beauty and what is ugly. And so one of the themes he deals with a lot is this. This is a corpse. This is a dead body, and he is strung up and dressed up. And in the old days, Witkin used to, this is done in 1999, would travel on airplanes with briefcases full of limbs, picking them up from various medical hospitals through the country to create his artwork. But post 9/11, I'm not sure Witkin can get on a plane these days with an arm in his baggage. Dealing with the whole idea of the body has become central to postmodern. This is Mark Quinn again, the guy we saw with the bloody head, where he's casting people who have been born with deformed limbs or had things amputated like soldiers, and he's casting them in white marble, and he exhibits these alongside Greek and Roman statues. And so one of the points he's trying to make is we look at those statues and we see them as the ideal height of beauty, and yet we look at something like this and we see an example of lack, something missing. We don't see the beauty. And so he's trying to just put the two together right next to each other and say, well, physically they're very similar. They look exactly the same. Why is it we can go from the height of beauty in Greek culture to some sort of freak or deformed person in a split second in the turn of a head, when essentially what we're looking at is the same thing? So he's doing what a lot of artists are doing today. They're bringing up questions. They're not necessarily answering them. They're not telling us what to think. They're not telling us how to think. But they're putting together a puzzle or a problem and just presenting it to people so that we can look at it ourselves, come to our own conclusion, and see what we think. Ron Mueck, he does huge or tiny scale sculptures of real life. Here's one of his. Another one, giant baby. And his stuff is very realistic. It's painted, it's detailed. And I've seen some of his work, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's almost like a giant person is lying down. In one of the pieces I saw is a tiny person, but so realistic that you had the feeling that this wasn't a sculpture. There was something very real about it. And so his work becomes very unnerving to see. One artist who's dealing with the body is James Luna. He's an American Indian. And here he was getting tired of seeing Indian tableaus in museums of these statues of people with headdresses and going how and la 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 la, all those kinds of sounds. And so he had himself installed in a museum in San Diego as a real Indian, lying down on sand with little placards describing the various scars that he has on his body from physical violence due to alcoholism. And so he's sort of bringing the plight of modern day American Indians. Here's a real Indian, here's a modern Indian, and here's what our life is like. And some of the response to this exhibition was, people were upset, they were angry, and one of the things written in the book was, he doesn't look like an Indian, where's his headdress? And so again, he's doing what the feminists were trying to do, kind of expose stereotypes, and that many of the representations we have of other people and other cultures are very one-sided, very narrow, and they don't really have the breadth and the depth that these people deserve. And so a very common theme in postmodern art. John Copland's an older gentleman here doing what Alice Neel was doing with her painting, photographs of his body as an old man. Catherine Opie dealing with issues of gender, male, female, masculine, feminine. One of the things that postmodern theory deals a lot with is that masculinity and femininity are not tied to the body necessarily. That if you're born with a penis, you're masculine. If you're born with a vagina, you're feminine. They believe that a lot of the ideas of femininity and masculinity are cultural, or they're part of the person irrespective of the kind of biological structure their body has. And so they're changeable, they're movable. And so most postmodern artists deal with that sort of fine line between what women are supposed to look like, what men are supposed to look like, what women are supposed to act like, what men are supposed to act like, and sort of blurring those lines and again putting it out there. And that takes all forms. Here's Marlene Dumas' painting of a young boy. We think of children as being innocent and sweet, but I think anybody who's been around kids or has had a kid knows that they have their moments when they can appear like little Hitlers, like this little guy. Joseph Beuys, a German artist, pioneering a form of artwork known as performance. Here he is in a New York Gallery, living with a coyote for 3 days. I like America, America likes me. The coyote was a symbol of America, more Native American, so it's a sacred symbol. He wanted to come to America in 1974, and for him to experience the real America was to live with a coyote. And so people would watch and film, and he would call this artwork. You can't buy it, you can't sell it. It's performance, it's real. He could be killed or attacked. At the end of the 3 days, he actually made friends with the coyote. And so for him, it was very shamanistic. He was more like a priest of old primitive cultures where they're dealing a lot with death and trance and animal spirits, and here in the context of a modern urban New York City. Dealing with the earth became a very big form of art in the 1970s. Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, now in Utah, still exists. Became another attempt to get art outside the gallery, but at the same time deal with the earth and the physical structure of the earth. And today we have an artist who's very well known named Andy Goldsworthy, who deals with natural objects, and his techniques are natural. So there's no glue, there's no tape, there's no scissors, no no nails. Everything's using what he finds around here. So these are icicles that he's glued together with water and let the water froze and attach them to a tree. So very beautiful works Goldsworthy does, very simple, very elegant, but using natural elements. And so he's making a comment also on sculpture. We often think of sculpture as something that lasts forever. That's what it's designed to do. For Goldsworthy, he's brought in the idea of impermanence. Things will only last a day or a few hours or a few minutes even. That they're temporary, they're quick. And so it's a whole different philosophy that he's bringing into the art. That he wasn't original. It was in the air in the 1950s in American art with Rauschenberg and John Cage and Duchamp even. Another example, this is leaves that he's found on the ground. He's just rearranged them in a different way, and that what appears to be a hole in the middle is just dirt that's been cleaned of all the little debris, and so it looks very dark. And so his work has got everything I just described, but it's elements that are already there in the environment. All he does is rearrange them. And then finally, our last slide, another icicle piece that you can tell within a few minutes of the photograph probably collapsed. Okay, thank you.